Happy Tuesday, everybody. It is time for the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast with Steele and Flip. Today's episode, taking a look at the Central Division, breaking it all down, fantasy, rankings, predictions, and an 8-1 analysis. Let's get right into it. Thanks for being here.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everybody, and welcome back inside the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast Lab. That is held down by my co-host, Mr. Steele Roden, and myself, Mr. Big Flip Livingstone. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. You can find us across all platforms you find your favorite and hottest content for free, including YouTube. So thank you so much for continuing to smash that subscribe button, showing some love to Steele and I. Everyone out there, we see you. The subscribe button is getting hammered right now, and we appreciate that. Keep it up because the season is just around the corner, which is why on today's episode, we are going to be starting our look at each division one by one, breaking it all down for you. This is what you guys need to know from a fantasy perspective. So that is why Steele and I will be taking a look at the teams in each division today, starting with the Central, breaking it down 8-1. Who we like, who we don't like, and what we think will happen for this upcoming season for the Central Division. But stay tuned for the rest of the week where we'll be hitting the Metro and every other division in the league. So thank you so much for that. Steele, it's been a tough couple of days for us. Lots going on in our lives, but that's okay. Hockey is what brings us all together, and that's why we're here. So why don't we start it off? Central Division, maybe the weakest division out there at a quick glance. I don't know. Colorado Avalanche, sure, Cup champs, but that bottom of the division is wide open, I would say.
Yeah, I think they have the two worst teams in the league in this division. You know, I'll just kick us off with the team who I think is going to finish last in the Central Division, and that's the Chicago Blackhawks. I think that's fairly obvious for a lot of people out there. I actually think they finished 10 points worse than they did last season, below 60 points. I actually have them finishing with 59 points at the end of the season. I think they will be the worst team across the entire league. And just looking at their lineup right now, they have 11 new additions on their team, whether they've added players over the offseason or players that they've called up from their farm team. So, you know, just looking at their roster right now, Peter Mrazek and Arvid Soderblom as their tandem in net. We know that Mrazek has dealt with injuries and has been injury prone for many, many years now. So I don't think that he's a great person to rely on. Neither is Arvid Soderblom, who hasn't played. I think he's played 3 games in the NHL so far in his career. I also believe Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews will be traded 100% at some point during the season, whether it be early on in November or December or just before the trade deadline to hit. So I think those two will be out of the Chicago Blackhawks organization. I don't think, as we've heard, Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane do not want to be part of a rebuild, and there have been connections to other teams out in the Eastern Conference. And to be honest with you, I've never seen a team blow up this quickly and this drastically. It just seemed like everything was going, decent for a little bit, and then everything just blew up in their face. This was a team that dominated for 7-8 years straight from 2010 to 2017. Even last year, they go out and get Seth Jones on the back end, the contract we can talk about on a different day, but they go out and get Seth Jones, who is a legitimate star defenseman. They still had Patrick Kane, still had DeBrincat, still had some young guys offensively. They had Marc-Andre Fleury, but everything just went out the window, and it really seems like they are going to be the worst team in the league.
Look, the bottom of this division, Steele, I have Arizona at 8, Chicago at 7. I think it's interchangeable. They're both going to be awful. They're both going to be bad. And looking at their off seasons, Blackhawks bring in Andreas Athanasiou, Max Domi, and Peter Mrazek. Hey, maybe Max Domi can salvage something of his career moving to a non-market or moving to a team that has no expectations. Obviously, Chicago is a big market. I shouldn't say that because that's incorrect. But hey, there's not a lot to like about these Blackhawks, not a lot to like about the Arizona Coyotes. I have Arizona finishing in 8th just because they're both bad, Steele. Like that's
they are.
And looking at this division overall, and I think this is why we wanted to start with the Central, because I really do feel it is the weakest one out there overall. And at the bottom, Arizona 8 for me, 7 for Chicago, and I have the Winnipeg Jets sliding into 6th. And realistically, I see all of those teams finishing with well below 70 points still. And I know the Winnipeg Jets still have some points, and I'm bouncing around a little bit here because I do think 6, 7, and 8 in this division really are taken up by the Winnipeg Jets, Chicago Blackhawks, and Arizona Coyotes. That's how I see it because, you know, Dallas Stars, Nashville Predators, Minnesota Wild, St. Louis Blues, and the Avs, to me, and I think you and I can both agree, are the 5 best teams in this division. And I think really that's where we're going to carry most of today's conversation because, look, there's diamonds in the rough to be found on the Arizona Coyotes. Diamonds to be rough in the rough, fantasy-wise, to be found with the Chicago Blackhawks. But really, you have to be careful here, people, because the Max Domis that I mentioned, Peter Mrazek's, these are very, very volatile fantasy pieces that I hope you don't have to mess with in your draft. I'm hoping that they're just pieces that you look at to augment your roster if things go haywire, because Steele, I don't think there's anywhere you can really hang your hat in the 8th, 7th, or 6th positions with this division.
Look, I completely agree with you about, the 8th and 7th place for the Central Division. It could be interchangeable. I do have Arizona at 7, finishing with 62 points. Like you said, there's not much to love here besides maybe Clayton Keller, Nick Schmaltz, and Gosh Despair on the back end, even Karel Vejmelka, who's going to be the starting goaltender for the Arizona Coyotes. Yes. What I really want to get my point across for Arizona, though, is that this organization needs to do whatever they can to entice free agents to want to come and play for this franchise, because that's really what they need right now. I do think they have some young guys who can play, but they need to really go out in the offseason or at the trade deadline and make some acquisitions so they can make some, get their team going in the right direction. And obviously that's hard to do when you have scandals, you lose draft picks, and you play an arena that can only hold 5,000 people. I don't agree with you, however, with the Winnipeg Jets. I think they're going to be the exact same as what we saw last year. They're an average team at best. I still think they finished with 85 to 87 points on the season, which is what they did last season as well. They didn't change really. They didn't really change anything. No. One of the teams that didn't really make any moves so far this offseason. Like I said, a fairly average team. The top 6 forward group, though, really amazing, in my opinion. Pierre-Luc Dubois, Kyle Connor. They're getting Perfetti in the top line right now. Obviously, you've got Ehlers, Scheifele, and Wheeler to finish out to round out the top 6. But looking at the bottom 6, there's nothing special about it. Besides Neil Pionk and Josh Morrissey, the defense is absolutely atrocious. They do have a top 15 goaltender, maybe even a top 10. Could be up for debate with Connor Hellebuck. But then they have a perennial backup in David Riddick. So everything to me just looks average for the Winnipeg Jets. And again, I think this is a team that just misses the playoffs ever so slightly.
Ooh, I like it. I think they're the main takeaway with the Winnipeg Jets is they really are going to rely on Rick Bowness, who's coming in to hopefully shake things up a little bit with basically the same crew. Kyle Connor, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Perfetti, Ehlers, Scheifele, Blake Wheeler, still a lot to like offensively. And if I'm a fantasy GM in the top, even 10 rounds, I'm probably happy taking any of those guys aside from maybe Perfetti because I'm just unsure what he's going to do this year. But all of those guys definitely turn the page offensively and are still very fantasy relevant. I don't know if the Winnipeg Jets overall are going to be playoff relevant, but I like what your take is here on the bubble because the teams at the bottom of this division are just going to be so far out of it that maybe that opens the door for the Winnipeg Jets to be better this season. There was a lot to not like with the Winnipeg Jets last season, on ice, off ice, and otherwise. So lots of room to improve, but there's also lots of room for you and I to discuss one of our favorite treats, and that's Built Bar Puffs. If you haven't tried them yet, I don't know why you're depriving yourself of one of life's joys. And guess what? These are indulgent. They are delicious, and they are covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right. Built has done it again. This is all the joys of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it or the guilt of all the doo-doo calories. Cookie dough chunk puffs only have 160 calories and a whopping 15 grams of protein in them. Run over to Built.com and snag yourself a box for you and the fam. It will be the perfect treat. Or you can easily find a good place to stash them just for yourself. Make sure you head over to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your order. That's right. Go to Built.com. Use promo code LOCK15 and get 15% off your order.
Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. We just hit 185 subscribers. We're 15 away from 200. So please keep hitting the subscribe button. Keep hitting the follow button. Flip and I appreciate all the love and support out there. And thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Flip, let's keep things rolling right now. We're on fire right now. I like where our heads are at, and I think we can continue to be on the same page, even though we did come into this blind. At number 5 in the Central Division, I have the Dallas Stars. I think they finished, again, like the Winnipeg Jets, at the same the same production rate they did last season. So I have them finishing with 96 points on the season. Again, one of those wild card bubble teams heading into the upcoming season. But again, I pretty much think they remain exactly where they were last year. They didn't really make any changes as well. No. Besides the addition of Mason Marchment and Colin Miller on the back end, you lose John Klingberg. Yep. I do think they have a decent duo in the crease with Jake Ottinger and Scott Wedgwood, who can back him up and can be that kind of guy to fill in if he needs to be. So again, like the Winnipeg Jets, didn't really make that many changes, but I do think, again, like we talked about last week with guys who we think can have a bounce back, Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, guys who have been called out by the management, by the organization, and have these huge contracts that they're not living up to right now. Yeah. So guys who need to bounce back, which I think they are able to. I still think they finished with 96 points, somewhat, it's pretty much the exact same where they finished last year, but again, on the bubble of a wild card spot.
Because of how good the Colorado Avalanche are, and actually how steady the St. Louis Blues and Minnesota Wild are, this division was one of the more quiet divisions in the offseason in terms of movement. And there's honestly, just at a quick glance at doing the research for this episode, I'm kind of glad we started with the Central, because I think there's really the least to discuss about this in terms of a difference next season. The ranking could be very much the same in terms of how things finish. I have the second and third place swapping a little bit. We'll see. But I'm with you here, Steele. I have the Stars at 5 as well. And to me, there is a little bit of a factor here that makes me want to kind of invest in some of these bounce back candidates, but you have to get them at the right round, because I do think Jamie Benn, Tyler Seguin are in for a bit of a step up season. I think there is some left in the tank for both of them. I just don't know where we're really going to get the best value out of them in terms of round, because they have been so spotty over the last couple of seasons. So I'm going to say this about the Stars, though. They lose Blake Como, Braden Holtby, Alex Radulov, Michael Raffle, and Andre Sekera. I think those are a bunch of losses that actually make your team better. This team is getting a little bit younger. They were one of the older clubs in the league for the last number of seasons. Let some of these younger guys go. Jason Robertson and Rupe Hintz are two good enough young players that I think some of those veterans around them will have a bounce back. You predicted one for Seguin. I think it could happen. I just don't know if they have enough on that blue line, because I do think Jake Ottinger is very much for real. That's a name that I think we should discuss very quickly, because I do think that if that kid can have some kind of special season, maybe that's enough to rock the boat and grab a wild card spot. I think they can do that if Jake Ottinger has the kind of season I expect him to.
Yeah, and that's a guy who's going to be taken very, very early. I believe he was taken in the second or third round in the fantasy draft I did a couple of months ago. And, obviously being at a young age, and after the season, we just, after the playoff series, we just witnessed against the Calgary Flames in the first round. This guy is legit. He is legit. So hopefully the Dallas Stars can lock him up for a long time, because he is that type of guy that can be a star for the Dallas Stars for many, many years. At number 4, though, in the Central Division, this is where things are going to get change up here for you, Flip. Okay. I have the St. Louis Blues in the 4th position in the Central Division. I believe they're still a playoff team, probably finishing first in the first wild card spot. I have them finishing with 101 points, 101 points at the end of the season. Again, still an absolute fantastic team to watch and have many players on their team that bring big fantasy value. So I'm not saying that they aren't a legit Stanley Cup contender, but I think losing David Perron and Ville Husso is going to hurt them a lot more than people expect this season. Not bad enough to miss the playoffs, but bad enough to drop them a spot in the division because they finished third in the Central last year. I think they finished fourth in the Central this year and finished first in the wild card spot. But again, still a fantastic team. We talked about them having one of the best lines in the league right now with Tarasenko, Buchnevich, and Thomas. So a lot to love about the St. Louis Blues, but they finished fourth in the Central for me with 101 points.
You and I do this on purpose so that we can have some differing of opinions when we give our lists. But other than the mix-up at the bottom, I think you and I are basically going to have the exact same ranking here because when I looked at the St. Louis Blues team, the reason they finished where they did last season in this division, I think, and they were right there with the Minnesota Wild for most of the season, interchanging second and third in the Central, was Ville Husso stepping up for Jordan Binnington when Binnington couldn't get it done in the middle of the second half there. And if not for Husso really stepping in and playing great, the Blues would have been on the bubble for a wild card spot. And now you lose the safety blanket of Husso. A lot of pressure on Jordan Binnington, and they almost had to go back to him because of his contract. I just don't know, Steele, if he's ready to take that. You know what I'm saying? There's no Ville Husso to step in and give him a couple of weeks to figure it out between the ears. So we saw the antics in the playoffs with Kadri. We saw him get hurt in the playoffs as well. Can he bounce back? That's a big question mark for me because the rest of this Blues team, in my opinion, and we've talked at length about Robert Thomas, but they have a lot to like up the middle. Yes. I think they have a solid group of centermen. Any team that can employ Robert Thomas, Ryan O'Reilly, and even a Braden Shen on the third line, to me, can roll three very, very competitive lines. And all of them are fantasy targets, in my opinion, in a top-tier manner. But look, Steele, this Central Division, I think we know the two teams that are going to be up for grabs. It's going to be the Wild and the Colorado Avalanche, in my opinion. But those Nashville Predators are going to be right there on the doorstep. So why don't you take us to break? Because I'm very interested to leave the end of this show for spots 3 through 1 in the Central Division. And Steele and I are going to drop a team to avoid in the Central Division if you're looking at fantasy players, and a team that you should be looking at for fantasy players as well, because that's what we're all about, baby.
We're all about the fantasy. We're all about the gambling here. Just want to thank all you fans and listeners out there so much for tuning into the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, making it your first listen every single day. Again, don't forget we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. So hammer the subscribe and the follow button. Flip and I appreciate all the love and support out there. And thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. And Flip, I don't think you're going to agree with my third choice here. I don't think you're going to agree with it. And it pains me to do this. It pains me to do it. But I have the Minnesota Wild in the third spot in the Central Division, finishing with 108 points. Pretty much every team so far for me in the Central has kind of gone down by 5 or 6 points.
Yeah.
And that's just because the rest of the league, to me, in my opinion, has gone better.
I agree.
So I have the Minnesota Wild finishing with 108 points this upcoming season. I believe they finished with 113 last year.
Yes, they did.
Again, like the St. Louis Blues, I think losing Kevin Fiala is going to hurt them a lot more than people expect. Again, just enough to drop them one spot in the Central. The bottom 6, I think they're really going to need to have to prove themselves to the organization. Matt Baldi, Tyson Jost, Marco Rossi, all these young guys who are just kind of, Tyson Jost has been in the league for a while now, or for a little while, but Matt Baldi, Rossi, who's going to get a crack at it this upcoming season. So those guys really have to step up their game. Looking at their goaltender situation, I do like it. Marc-Andre Fleury is on the higher side of things. He's 37 years old. Philip Gustafson is going to be backing him up. So I think that is a great backup because, it would just be a waste to have Cam Talbot back there. So I really do like the trade by that. But yeah, I have them third in the Central Division with 108 points to finish the season.
I'm right with you. I'm right with you on the ranking 100%. And maybe the second and first position is going to leave. There's no chirping here because you said it. The rest of the league was, and I mean rest of the league in comparison, the other three divisions were much busier than the Central. It was almost like they got lost in the shuffle, knowing that they have to go up against the Colorado Avalanche again next year, and maybe they're just biding their time for the Avalanche to really take a step back. I'm with you, though. I think this entire division kind of lost out a little bit on some opportunities to really augment their rosters for a big playoff push next season, because you and I have spoke about this at length now. The Eastern Conference has had that shift in power, shift in quality. The Atlantic Division got so good in the offseason. The Metro, in our opinion, was the best last season. So maybe the Western Conference was just kind of holding pat and going at it with what they have. But the Minnesota Wild have a lot to like in their attack. Yeah. A balanced one. I love that they have some young pieces in Rossi and Baldi. They have some bigger players in Greenway and Foligno to mix it up and bring that edge. They lose Nick Delorier, but I think that's okay because they have enough size and grit. Look, their biggest loss over the offseason is Nick Bjugstad. That's okay. That means you're bringing back basically the same lineup.
Well, Kevin Fiala, right? Kevin Fiala.
Yeah, you're right. Kevin Fiala is the biggest loss. That is 100% accurate. I guess after that, though, basically the same team. But I'll leave it at this with you, Steele. And I said it before, and I will say it again. Kirill Kaprizov is a good enough player. And in now my opinion, after what we saw last year, watch this kid go, because he is that kind of player to pick up his team. And I really do think some of these pieces around this lineup this year, and you mentioned a guy like Matthew Baldi, if Baldi gets some looks on the power play unit or on a secondary power play unit with some of those top players, Matt Baldi is definitely a guy that I'm going to be having my eye on, Steele, in some of the later rounds, because we've seen that he can snipe.
He is a great player. We saw what he was able to do, when he was in the lineup, like you said. So I am excited to see the Minnesota. I'm always excited to watch the Minnesota Wild. Always rooting for them. I believe they are a cup contender, and I think once the deadline comes, make a couple of additions, maybe a couple of trades to bolster the lineup, but that is a far, far time from now. The second team in the Central Division, Flip, is obviously the Nashville Predators.
Yeah.
I told you when we were making our 5 bowl predictions, I had them being a top 5 team in the league next season. You did. And that's what they are going to do this upcoming season. I believe so, because this team on paper, it does look phenomenal to me. And, obviously there aren't like some superstar names that jump off like Connor McDavid or Austin Matthews, but every single line, in my opinion, looks great. So, when we're talking about the best lines or the best trios, an honorable mention for me was Matt Duchene, Ryan Johansson, and Philip Forsberg. I think they've got some great depth, adding Nino Niederreiter, Mikael Granlund down the middle, Colton Sissons down the middle. And they have some young guys who show a lot of promise in Philip Tomasino, Cody Glass, and Tanner Jeannot. So I really like, the depth, the young guys, the stars you have as your first line, a top 5 goalie in the league in UC Saros, and a defensive core that just really stands out, in my opinion. Obviously, the addition of Ryan McDonough as well, but Roman Josi, Dante Fabro. So I've never been a fan of the Nashville Predators, but I am loving this team right now. I think they're a top 5 team in the league this year. And seriously, I have them finishing second in the Central Division with 112 points. So that is about, I believe last year they finished with 98 or 99 points. So that's a big
97 points.
Okay, 97 points. So that's a big jump. That's over, I can't do math right now, but over 10 points for sure.
Hey, it's an improvement, and I think that's what we can leave right here. And I think that also means, though, this is a team that you have to be looking at for some very, very good fantasy value options that some other GMs are going to be sleeping on. And, Steele and I always try and give you guys the main rundown of the meat and potatoes of the fantasy world, but we're also here to highlight some of these guys. Tomasino, Cody Glass, Tanner Jeannot. In the right rounds, in deeper formats, Tanner Jeannot is going to be a guy I'm going after. Yes. He was in the top 5 in the league in hits. He is just developing, and I'm telling you, when you have such a good, responsible, defensive, two-way group in Nashville that you do, some of these younger players have a lot of room to develop. There's not a lot of pressure on them because the rest of the team is being held down by the Forsbergs, the Granlunds. Don't sleep on Eli Tolvanen as well, who is a very sneaky end of first-round pick from a number of years ago. But still, GM David Poile in Nashville, very much like Lou Lamoriello, he makes moves in silence. He's like a GM ninja out there. He knows McDonough can't be afforded in Tampa. He gets him for cheaps. Re-signs their big name in Philip Forsberg, adds some forward depth with Nino Niederreiter, and all of a sudden, people look at last year and go, oh, they got bounced in the first round. They got bounced in the first round having to play a third-string goaltender against the reigning Cup champions. That is not a fair designation of how good this team is. And I think aside from those fantasy targets that we already mentioned, this Nashville Predators team is definitely worth a look at some futures bets. All of that we will be covering over the next few weeks because, boy, am I ready to start sprinkling some bets across this NHL board, Steele. But, hey, I'm with you, brother. Second spot, Nashville Predators, babe.
And that obviously leaves the last team, which is going to finish in first in the Central Division for both Flip and I, and that's obviously the reigning champ, Colorado Avalanche. I have them finishing with 115 points, so 4 points less than what they did last year. That's just because obviously they've lost Darcy Kemper. You have you have one goaltender who was a backup, but you get Alexander Georgiev, which you and I have discussed at length about those two being able to battle it out for them. But this is also the team that you need to target for fantasy players. So Nathan McKinnon, Gabriel Landeskog, Mikko Rantanen, Cale Makar, Devin Taves, the two goalies I just mentioned. There's a lot of players on the bottom six that you can get late in the later rounds in rounds 12, 11, 12, and 13. So a lot to love for the Colorado Avalanche. Still the best team in the Central Division, but it is going to be close with the Nashville Predators and the Minnesota Wild.
I think so, Steele. And look, we know Nazem Kadri is not yet officially signed anywhere, but it looks like it will be the New York Islanders. I don't see him going back to Colorado. So I'm giving this assessment based on the fact that they do not have Nazem Kadri, and they are still good enough to be in first. But I could see them in for some tough spots next year. Alexander Georgiev has never really had the full opportunity to be a number one, and Pavel Francouz is also a career backup. Pavel Francouz was great at times in the postseason last year, stepping in for Darcy Kemper, and I know we like both of those options fantasy-wise just because they play on the Colorado Avalanche, but still, they might want to get out to a hot start because these Nashville Predators, Minnesota Wild, and St. Louis Blues team were tired of having to look at those cup photos from last season, and they're fired up. I'm going to tell you, that's going to be a motivated Central Division. And look, busy offseason for the Colorado Avalanche. Lots of players re-signed. Manson, Lehkonen, Nichushkin, Cogliano, Helm even. So lots to be re-signed, but they lose Kemper. They lose Burakovsky. They lose Kadri. Do I think they are still very much in the mix for the Stanley Cup? Of course. Do I think they might not finish in first in the division as easily as they did last year? I'm also feeling that because those Minnesota Wild, St. Louis Blues, and especially Nashville Predators, I think are going to be motivated to knock them off their top seed. And I'll leave you with this, Steele, because I need to highlight a player that I think you and I have mentioned a little bit, but Alex Newhook was a bona fide star for its World Junior Team Canada a couple of years ago, and we've seen some of these players who play great in those tournaments fade away, but we've also seen some of these players really solidify their careers in that World Junior Tournament, and I think Alex Newhook is just on the cusp of being a really good fantasy target, and again, he's one of those guys that I will be looking at in the bottom rounds because, hey, if there's an injury to a Comfer or someone else up that lineup, he is going to slot right in there into that top six and be starting to play some serious minutes with some really good players.
I like that you highlight Alex Newhook because he did show a lot of promise last year during the regular season and sometimes during the playoffs. I'm really glad that you and I started with the Central Division because you're right. This was probably the easiest one to start with. Not a lot of changes like the other leagues. So I have a feeling that once we do get to the Metro, the Atlantic, and the Pacific, we're not going to be on the same page. We're going to be able to get a little bit more of debate in.
I agree.
And, we're going to be able to get into it a little bit more, but these are our rankings for the Central Division. Please leave a comment. Let us know what you think of the rankings of the Central Division, what you might change, where you think they might finish in the Central, and how many points they will finish with. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. But for your second listen, please check out the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On experts give you a daily 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. just like this one right here. So make sure, again, you hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. Once you do, you'll get all the latest episodes of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day. Good luck with all your bets out there, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.